So welcome, everyone. We are so happy to see you today for our meeting at the seminar series that's been organized by the Hong Kong Baptist University Center for Translation for more than 20 years now, I understand. Good afternoon for everyone joining here from Hong Kong. Good morning or good evening for people joining from different time zones. It is my pleasure to introduce today our distinguished guest speaker, Professor Kobus Marais from the University of Free State in Bloemfontein. Professor Marais is a leading figure in translation studies, having published extensively in the field. His work spans a wide range of topics, from complexity theory approaches to translation and development studies, to biosemiotic theories of translation. He's also the author of 3 monographs, including his most recent work, Trajectories of Translation, the Thermodynamics of Semiosis, published in June 2023. Professor Marais has also edited several volumes, contributing significantly to our understanding of translation beyond traditional boundaries, especially with his most recent one, titled The Complexity of Social Cultural Emergence, Biosemiotics, Semiotics, and Translation Studies, that was published just this year. Here I also want to mention the special issue of Linguistica Antwerpiencia from December 2022 on translational approaches to inclusive development that I edited together with Professor Kobus Marais, including even 5 articles. So this special issue includes 5 articles that concern, in some aspects, Chinese language. So he's very familiar also with the use of Chinese language and translation and development. Today, though, Professor Marais will be speaking to us about expanding the conceptualization of translation beyond its traditional linguistic and anthropocentric biases. His talk promises to challenge our understanding of translation, exploring it through the lens of biosemiotics and considering translational actions across species. So please join me in welcoming Professor Kobus Marais. Professor, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dr. Todorova, for these kind words and for inviting me and for being here, even though you are jet lagged. I appreciate it. Also, for Esther Kok, who made most of the arrangements and technical things, organized them with me and held my hand through them. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. So in 2006, Maria Timoshko wrote a paper in which she talked about things that translation studies thinks it knows, but obviously which she then suggested translation studies is actually wrong about what they think they know. And one of the things that she said is that translation studies thinks, at that point, that translation is done by professionals. In other words, translation is something that is done by somebody who's had training, who subscribes to an ethical code or a professional code, who has a job in the formal sector, and whatever you want to think about professional. But the main argument is translation studies think translation is done by professionals. So if she's right, and I think I will show you in a while that I think she's indeed right, that actually then means literally that, to use the English idiom, every Tom, Dick, and Harry is a translator. Translation, if translation studies is wrong about the fact that translation is done by professionals, if in fact translation is done by people, then it means we are all translators. It means that non-professional translators are also translators. And it means that what has been described, I think in the 70s already, as natural translation is something that takes place every day in our lives. If we live in multilingual countries, for instance, like South Africa or India or many other places. So that's sort of the point that I want to take and say, I think I agree with Timoshko. She's right, which then means that every Tom, Dick, and Harry is a translator. But what she did not argue is that non-humans can also be translators. And what I want to show you today is the arguments that when life started, meaning making started with it. Life couldn't happen without semiosis, without meaning making, which then actually means that all living organisms translate, not only all humans, but everything that lives in some way translate, which is why I then say, just to be funny, Fido and Puss in Boots are also translators. So my argument, I think, comes against the background of what we now call the ecological crisis. And I think the ecological crisis requires of us to rethink the relationship between humans and non-humans, and between all living organisms and inert matter on the other hand. I'm not going to go into the relationship with inert matter today. I'm just going to focus on, what does the ecological crisis require of us as translation studies scholars in terms of what we can contribute? How can we help in terms of the ecological crisis? And my suggestion would be that one of the ways we could help is to facilitate and help understand and study the meaning-making of non-human animals. So I am first going to give you a few examples of works that have been done about non-professional translation. In other words, proving that Timoshko was right in 2006 already, that translation is not necessarily a professional activity. So the first book actually came out even before Timoshko. I haven't checked whether Timoshko cited this, but it doesn't matter. So Antonini in 2004 already had this book on revisiting the interpreter's role. And the main argument of the book was that we cannot say that there's one role, in other words, a professional role for interpreters in this case, to play everywhere and in all times. Social context is key in determining what role interpreters and translators play. And sometimes the context determines that they be professionals, and sometimes the context determines that they not be. So this idea has been coming at least for 20 years now. In another book just shortly after that, the authors brought together a number of chapters, and I'm always scared to pronounce some of these names, so I will just talk about the authors. So in this volume, the sort of main argument was that up until then, people in translation studies, interpreting studies have thought about professionalism from the definition that Parsons, the sociologist, gave. And his definition was sort of saying that for you to be professional, you need a particular competence, you need a functional expertise, and there need to be universal standards for this profession. And the book explores the possibility that actually there are no set rules for when something becomes a profession. It's usually a struggle between interest groups in the fields, and they try and get control over the field, right? So people, this is what the argument would be, people arguing for professionalism want the professionals to control the field of translation, while people arguing for non-professionalism want the non-professionals to control. So they give a bit of a different angle to the argument. Then in 2012, Perez Gonzalez and Susam Sarajeva brought out a special edition of Philippus Translation Studies, can't remember. And their main argument was that non-professional translation, interpreting and translation is becoming a thing. And it's becoming a thing because globalization and migration lies behind it. And from their data, they could prove this. They also made the case that we should look at translation as the superordinate, as the broad category, and then professional translation is only one aspect of translation, generally speaking. So there could be professional, semi-professional, non-professional, a-professional, whatever you want to call it, was their argument. What I will show in a moment is that, in my view, this set of papers, or at least the introductory chapter to it, sort of represents quite a Eurocentric view of the reasons why NPIT is becoming important. And I will talk about that in a moment a bit more. So 7 years ago, another Antonini also edited a book on non-professional interpreting and translation. And again, she said that one of the reasons why non-professional interpreting and translation is becoming important is because of globalization. People need to talk to one another much more than when they lived in their own little villages. So, but also the technology makes it possible. Like today, we can have people speaking as many languages as there are people in the audience. And they start asking the question, and this is sort of what's implied in what I'm trying to say today, is should professionalism be the end goal? Should we strive that all translational actions be professional? Or should we, from the beginning, say that there's actually the most of what's happening in translation and interpreting is happening non-professionally, informally, naturally, between people in multilingual context. So out of these ideas came the NPIT conferences. I think there have been at least 4 or 5 now. I think I attended about the 3rd one. And the one that I attended in Stellenbosch in, what was it, 2018, sort of had this line of argument that in the European context, non-professional interpreting and translation happens in abnormal contexts. It happens where people are displaced through war, or people are displaced through geological factors or crisis happening, or even people migrating for economic reasons. So it's kind of an abnormal thing that all of a sudden now in Europe, in a monolingual country like France, there are now people speaking 20, 30 more languages. While in contexts like Africa, this is everyday life. This is not an abnormal thing. South Africa has 12 official languages. Cameroon has like 270. Kenya has 50, 60, I think. in India, there are, I think, 40, 50 different languages being spoken. So in many contexts in the world, non-professionalism is the norm. Translation just between people who somehow find ways to communicate with one another by knowing a bit of each other's languages, by finding ways to point and to use gesture and to have a friend who can speak a language. It's sort of much more everyday life thing. So for me, I think the evidence shows that every Tom, Dick, and Harry is a translator, if they live in a, or they are in a context where they have to speak more than one language or have to function in more than one language. What I want to add is the point that I think we need to take this one step further to include non-human animals. And to explain that to you, I need to explain a bit about biosemiotics, and I'm going to do this in two parts. Firstly, I'm going to show you why biosemioticians say all living organisms communicate, all living organisms translate. So I'm going to do that. And then I'm going to close with what I would call applied biosemiotics to show you a number of studies that has been done on interspecies communication, etc., which the idea is sort of to entice you. Maybe you want to do something similar. Right. So the basic principle in biosemiotics is that life and communication pretty much co-evolved. The one had to be there for the other one to be there. So if you think of how life originated, according to what we know now, it started as a single-cell organism. And that single-cell organism had to communicate with its surroundings. And that is what is called exosemiosis that I have on my slide. So this single-cell organism, bacterium or something like that, had to sense information from outside of it through its membrane, and then have a way of, in inverted commas, deciding whether this is food and then move in that direction to get the food, or whether this is maybe danger and move away from it, or whether it's something that you can just ignore. Right? So the moment living organisms started, this requirement for them to be able to interpret information from outside of them for the sake of them surviving, that was immediately given with the emergence of life. But then, after I don't know how many million years of single-cell organisms, we saw the emergence of multicellular organisms, and that added the requirement of what is called endosemiosis. In other words, if something now exists of 2 cells, or 10 cells, or 50 billion cells, these cells need to communicate with each other because they are now subject to the interests of the larger group, right? So each one cannot do their own thing. You would probably have seen this cartoon of the 2 donkeys. One sees the food on the one side, and the other one sees the food on the other side, and they're going in different directions, right? So that for multicellular life to develop, that couldn't have happened. You needed to find ways, or life needed to find ways inside, in the body of the organism, internally, to communicate. In human bodies these days, the heart has to communicate with the lungs, has to be linked to the central nervous system, has to be linked to the muscles. So if you run, the message somehow has to go through that you now need more oxygen, which then needs to say, tell your heart to pump harder. So there's this very internal kind of meaning making. So the communication with outside of this, let's say the self, whether that's now a bacterium or a human, and the communication inside in multicellular organisms, those were things that developed together with life. So this means that life is not only a mechanical or a mechanistic process. For a long time in biology, life was explained as, you know, bodies are like machines. If you push this lever, that lever will move. If you do this, that will move. It was seen as very mechanistic. Even sometimes the debates about genetic changes are quite mechanistic. What biosemioticians saw, and many of them are theoretical biologists, is that life itself is based on communication, on semiosis, on meaning making. For something to be alive, as I said now, it has to be able to communicate. So the question, and this is a question I can't answer today, partly because it's a very long answer and partly because I only understand part of it, is how did matter, which was not alive, became alive? And the one of the features of being alive is that your actions and your behavior is intentional. It is about something. So an atom just links to another atom if there's a force between them. But the atom itself, according to what we know, has no interests, has no intentions, while a living thing wants to survive. So it is intentionally about survival. It wants to find a mate, to procreate. It's about the mate. It wants to have food. It wants to be safe. So it has all these features of aboutness, and it is still matter, but it has become intentional. And how has it become intentional? It has become intentional through semiosis, because it now has to interpret that which is outside of it as a sign of food, as a sign of a good mate, as a sign of shelter or whatever. So I think it's for me, from this, it's clear that humans are not the only meaning-making organisms on our planet, that we have many more, what we would call animals, what we would call plants, what we would call fungi and algae. Those would all be, I think it's the 5 kingdoms, they would all be meaning-making organisms. And I come back to the how in a moment. So this means that humans actually share many meaning-making abilities with many other species. And I'm going quite quickly over this, but this is a very deep insight, which actually means that we share semiotic processes with other animals. That animals and even plants are in a sense more like us than we think, because some of the basic communication abilities we share with each other. And I will get back to this point, I think about twice still in the rest of the talk. So I think at this point you might think, well, saying that a bacterium communicates in the same way as a human, that's a bit of a tall order. And if you were to think that, you were right? So, in biosemiotics, we argue that all organisms, all life, are semiotically active, but they're not semiotically equal. So we're not saying that the semiosis in a plant happens in exactly the same way as semiosis in a human being. We're not saying that plants translate meanings in the same way that humans do, right? So they are all doing it, but in different ways. So one of the really interesting fields of exploration now is to see how can we describe the differences. What is similar and what is different at various levels. So, for instance, in work that I did with biologist Kalevik Kuhl, we distinguished between biotranslation, which is translation as it takes place in all living organisms except humans, and then eutranslation, which is human translation, which includes language. So the distinction here is that in biotranslation, there's no language, and in human translation, there is language. So that's one way of saying what the differences are and what the similarities are. There are also other ways. Tom Sebeok, already in the 70s, spoke about endosemiotics. So I explained endosemiotics to you. That's the semiotics that, or semiosis that takes place inside of a living organism. Then zoosemiotics is basically all animals, how they communicate. And anthropocentric is, again, humans with the ability to language. But there's also another one that Sebeok suggested, and that is phytosemiotics, which is algae, fungi, and plants. Biosemiotics, which are all animals. And then anthroposemiotics, which is human beings. So, yeah. So I think you need to understand that this process started out as a very primitive one. And John Deely sort of captured this in the saying that initial semiotic activity had basically only three options. You approach if it's a food or a mate, you avoid if it's a predator or a competitor, or you ignore if it's not relevant. You only had to make those three decisions, right? So you had to sense the information from outside your body, determine whether it was approachable, whether it should be avoided, or whether it should be ignored. And this is very basic to what meaning making is. But this evolved, and there are a number of articles written about how this evolution takes place. It's about, according to different scholars, somewhere between 8 and 10 different stages of development that semiosis went through. But I'm going to just quickly share a few with you. So initially in something like a bacterium, the semiosis is pretty much just at the level of molecular recognition. So a bacterium doesn't think. It has no central nervous system. It's not sentient in any way. It's probably not even irritable in any way. The only thing that it does is through its membrane, it can recognize when something is food, and then it has little flippers which it uses to swim towards the food. So the translation process there is a very basic chemical recognition or a molecular recognition process. Then you get in plants and further developments, you get what they call irritability, where the organism has sense organs that can be irritated. In other words, to move or to grow more leaves or to do whatever it needs to do. Later on, when you have higher animals, you get sense perception, where they can get information through the various senses like touch and smell and taste, and so on. And each of these entails a translational process. So what you do is, what the tree would do is it will experience, or not a tree, an animal, it would experience a certain smell, and then it would interpret that smell as this is a dangerous animal, I have to flee, right? So with your sense perceptions, you then, or you translate those into what it means for the organism. And then obviously, where we are as humans, where you have sentience, which we share with well, at least mammals. But then where we have reflective consciousness based on our linguistic abilities would for now be probably the highest level of semiosis. But the important thing is here is that although human beings have unique semiotic abilities and unique translational abilities, we also share molecular recognition, irritability, sense perception, information gathering, sentience with other animals, right? So we can actually learn by studying how other animals, and even plants and so on, how they interact and communicate. We can learn something about what underlies our linguistic abilities. So the implication here is that because we share an embodied biological kernel of communication with other animals, it means that we are not as smart and as independent and as constructivist as we think we are. So I think biosemiotics gives us a bit of an argument to say that the human idea that we construct all knowledge and it's therefore our constructions that count is not that simple. And you can go and read John Dewey, or you can go and read Maurice Merleau-Ponty, the philosopher, and you can read cognitive semiotics, embodied stuff, which will talk to this kind of argument. It also means that we are not completely exceptional. We have some unique features, but we share a lot with other animals. It also means that all life forms are actually linked to one another, right? It's not we as humans is one life form, and then there's an absolute difference with animals and an absolute difference with plants. It's actually gradual transitions that evolved, which brought us where we are. But it doesn't mean that we are now completely original, or that the rest of our environment is completely dumb, if I can simplify it. I think biosemiotics also questions the strong forms of cultural and linguistic relativism. If we say that we are one species as humans, then it means that there are biologically embodied things that we share. And culture and our languages haven't taken those things away. It's obviously difficult now these days to talk about it because of many ideological reasons. But I'm just saying, I think we might want, in terms of biosemiotics, we might want to think also about what biologically links us and our semiotic abilities, rather than only say it's only culturally and only linguistically and therefore completely relative. Right. So in the rest of the time, I quickly want to share some examples of applied biosemiotics with you. So I'm first going to show you 3 studies that is probably not something that you can do, that we as translation studies scholars can do on our own, because it requires expertise from biologists and environmental specialists and ecologists and so on. But this 2016 study studied termite mounds. On the left-hand side, you can see the termite mound. But then it shows internally in that termite mound how complex this thing is structured, which means that if a termite mound with thousands of termites want to work, there need to be communication between them. So this is a pretty basic, I think, and a simple example of how animals and ants are not high animals, they're not mammals, how animals communicate in order to sustain themselves and to maintain their existence in their world. There's also a study done in 2015 which showed that certain species live together based on how much noise they make. And if you live in a city and there is sound degradation or noise pollution, it attracts certain animals and it pushes away certain animals. So this is an interesting study where the influence of human built environments on animal behavior has been studied. A 2012 study looked at how the body of the human internally communicates. If we want to say that as a human I have agency, it means that whatever the I is, have to control the various streams of semiosis, right? So if the I has to control the muscles, has to get a message to the muscles to do a certain thing. This is probably a very medical kind of study, which we won't be able to do, but just to show you what kind of studies people have done. And maybe for these studies, you could find experts, fellow students doing this research at postgraduate level that you can collaborate with and bring the translation side into the study. There's also a study done on mentally ill non-human minds. And this is a fascinating study which shows that over the thousands of years that dogs have been domesticated by humans, they have grown bigger frontal lobes in their brains because of the interactions with humans, which is emotional interactions, right? But because they now have, comparative to animals of their size, because they now have bigger frontal lobes, it also means they suffer from mental illnesses like depression or obsession or aggression in certain cases. So this is a case where the study looked at how the influence of domestication played out in the literally the brain size, the physiology of the animal, and how that impacted on their mental health. And then you would all know all the studies that have been done about ape language. I'm not going to go into that. Studies that we could do with, maybe also with people from other fields, is like this one. How can the built environment be changed to help guide dogs in decision making? So this author looked at the built environment and seeing that all signage was at the level of human eyes. There's no signage at the level of dog eyes. And could signage be changed in an environment at the level of the dog eyes so that dogs can learn how to interpret it and then guide their blind companions better? Philip Jaros also did really interesting studies about cat colonies, and he found that we cannot study cat colonies anymore sort of from the outside, because cats have been domesticated for so long, and we have started influencing each other's social behavior. Just like the dogs have mentally been influenced, cats and their colonies are being influenced. And this is a kind of study which you could do in your little town or on your campus to see how people interact with cats and how that have as an influence. You can observe the cats, describe their habits, etc., etc. There was also a study about pedagogy. So if animals also communicate, what does that mean for our teaching practices? It's a bit maybe far off from what we are trying to do. There are also studies by various biosemioticians about zoos, which is a hot topic in animal rights debates. So you could, for instance, just go and observe at a zoo how people interact with the animals. You can ask them questions and gain insight in the relationships between animals and the communication between animals and humans. And then you would probably, most of you would have seen the South African documentary movie, My Octopus Teacher, But there's also been scientific studies, sorry, it's 2014, not 1040, about how octopuses mimic their prey. So if they want to catch a certain snake, they turn their tentacles into the color and the shape of that snake, and the snake thinks it's a mate, and then it's actually a predator, right? So it goes back to that very basic semiotic ability that I spoke to you about: approach, avoid, ignore. I want to close by showing you a recent study that my colleague, Dr. Zani Jansen van Vuren, did. She wrote a PhD, and it is in the process of being published, hopefully 2025. And the book's title will be Interpreting Communication and Animal Welfare, an Ecosemiotic Analysis of Interspecies Translation. So what she did is she started observing animal welfare situations in South Africa, where horse owners would bring their horses to a welfare clinic, and there would be a welfare worker who then advises them on their health. There would be a vet that maybe give them injections and so on. But the initial part of the study was to check the interpreting between the humans, because the vet might speak English and the horse owner might speak Sesotho, and maybe the community care worker might speak Afrikaans, right? So the idea was to study interpreting in these settings. But what Dr. van Vuren then did is to realize that, well, the animals are also participating in this communication. And she included the animals' communication in the interpreting setting. So if you look at the picture in front of you, it actually shows a lot of things. But to simplify, you will see just to the sort of in the middle of the picture to the right, the horse has a sore on its front leg. Now, semiotically speaking, any bodily activity is a sign of something, right? So in this case, a sore is a sign of the fact that the tack that is being used, you can see these chains and things, are not working and they are hurting the horse, right? So through what Dr. van Vuren did is to say, the horse, if we include the horse in the communication, the horse's body and symptoms from the horse's body tell us certain things, which we then in human language explain to one another in different languages, right? So the interpreting process is not only amongst humans, but it includes animals. She also has other lovely data where the horse is scared, and he would pull his head up, and he would pull his ears back, and the humans interpret that and tell each other, this is what the horse is now doing, this is what it means, and let's calm it down, and so on and so on. So I think those of you interested in animal welfare, if you want to do studies like this, that would be great in different contexts, not only with horses. You can do this with birds, you can do it with dogs and cats, and other animals. I'm not sure how you're going to do it with snakes and iguanas and all these things that people also have of pets, but that's up to you. So to close, implications. So I think biosemiotics is relevant because humans are not the only species that translate. We've said all humans translate, not only professionals, but I think we need to be serious in saying all living organisms translate, not only humans. And if we want to be ecologically responsible, I think in the day and times that we live, translation studies need to include biosemiotics because that will help us communicate with the other. It will help us respect the other. It will help us take these animals not just as an extension of us, you know, it's my pet or it's my food or whatever, but to understand them in their own right and how they communicate. Dr. van Vuren and I are working hopefully on trying to work this out a bit more in a publication over the next few years. Yeah, so I said translation studies could contribute to understanding the other, which is in this case non-human organisms. Right? I did speak about the idealist assumptions that I think biology calls on us to be a bit more materialist. We also need to deal with the materiality and the embodiedness, and not only with the ideas that gets translated. And we need to check our interpretations against reality. But lastly, I think the point is probably, or another point is probably, that we can learn from one another. I think the better we understand how, let's say, lower forms of life communicate, the better we understand our own bodily or our own embodiedness in communication. Because remember, we didn't fall out of the air. Bacteria evolved into things, which evolved into things, which evolved into things, which eventually became humans. So we share the DNA, we share the bodily structures, we share the communication structures of many of these. And I think we could learn. There are, for instance, books, I think, about things like learning to think with trees, something like that, which and I'm not saying all of these things are correct, but it's explorations on what could we learn from other life forms in how they exist and how they interact with their environment. Okay, with that, I think I'm done for now. I've tried with Google Translate to get the Chinese for thank you. I'm not sure whether I hope I'm not offending anybody, but this is what Google Translate gave me. So just to show my respect, and then we have thank you in English. Kia leboa is the Sotho. It's one of our languages, and dankie is Afrikaans, which is also one of our languages. So thank you very much for your time, and yes, questions and comments and fights.
Thank you, Professor Marais, for, as always, a very inspiring talk, and a talk that challenges us, gives us a lot of, food for thought, and kind of makes us think beyond what our mainstream kind of translation studies, education gives us. So we're very thankful for this talk. And now to the audience, you can, so what follows is the Q&A session as usual, and you can pose your questions or give us your comments by raising your hand, and then you will be unmuted and you can pose your question verbally, or you can type your question in the chat, and then I can try to follow and ask as many questions as I can from the chat. And we already have two, so I'll start with the first one. It's a very interesting talk, Professor. I'm Marais from Indonesia. I would like to ask, how can biosemiotic principles enhance our understanding of the translation process when dealing with nonverbal elements in text, such as imagery, symbols, and cultural artifacts?
That is a difficult question. I think we are, in a sense, still in the process of figuring that out. So rather than trying to give you a final answer, I can point you in a number of directions. So there's a professor in Spain, Africa Vidal Claramonte. She has done a lot of work on translation in art, translation of objects, etc. So scholars are starting to explore the materiality of these kind of interlingual translations. There's also now two books coming out. The one is already out. I think it is The Experience of Translation by Madeleine Campbell and another Vidal, but not Africa, Ricarda Vidal. And they are also going to bring out a sequel to that book. The first one is the experience of translation. The second one is the translation of experience, where they are exploring the materiality of art and the embodied experience of art and the translations between them. So also Piotr Blumczynski from Queen's University has just written a book about experiential translation, and I think that might be worthwhile. So I would say what biosemiotics made me aware of is that translation processes take place at, let's say, different levels, right? And I think what we might want to investigate then is, so at the level of the perception of color, how does my body react to that? How do I interpret color as a sign, and how does my body respond to it, and how do I then maybe express that feeling, affect, embodied experience in an artwork, right? So I think and let's say human biology or physiology can help us there. There are studies that are working in detail of how sense perception or sense experience becomes perception, becomes transmitted in the brain into ideas, becomes worldviews, right? So I think you need to go and look into those kind of studies, which sort of originates in our biology and explains to us how our biology contributes to meaning making as human beings. So I think at the very least, biosemiotics is telling us, don't look at language only. Also look at the body. But how to do that, I think, is still pretty much a debate.
Right. Okay. Thank you. There's a few other questions. Very inspiring. How do you think translation studies can help drive the interspecies translation, for example, between cats and humans? Is that possible, or will that be possible?
Yeah. Yes. So I think the body of knowledge on interspecies communication is growing, not only between humans and other animals, but between other animals. So how does a dog and a cat communicate, if we can put it that way? So there are studies in this. I think that one of the big problems, and we discuss it quite a bit in our department between various colleagues, is the problem of anthropocentrism. I'm worried that this question is asked from the perspective of humans. How can animals help us feel better? We should also ask, how can we help animals feel better? Right? We should also ask, what does it mean to be a cat, and how should I adapt to that? So there's in philosophy and ethics, there's a lot of work being done about how to deal with the other. The other is a different gender. The other is uses a different language. The other has a different skin color. The other, I mean, there are various others that we have to deal with. But when it comes to animals, we think of them not as others, but as kind of extensions of ourselves. And I think that's part of the debate that we need to address and to work. I think the contribution that translation studies here can make is, we know something about communication between systems that don't fit. And we could help ecologists, we could help vets to work through and better understand how communication systems that don't fit, not at the level of language, but at the level of embodied and even chemical interaction. can we get insight and can we say something about how that works and can we understand that? So much of this is work in progress. You will see that I don't have, we're not at the point where we can say, if you, like we say in English, if you have a passive construction in English translated in German in an active construction or whatever, right? We're not at that level where we can already map these things. We need more studies to understand that.
We have a raised hand, so maybe we can go to the raised hand.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. Hi, Kobus. Hi, Marais. Yeah, so I actually post part of my question into the chat, so later on you can ignore that. I have two questions in particular. The first one is connected with this idea of biosemiotics and translation, and the talk that you give. At the very beginning, you said, when life begins, it starts to make meaning. So sort of what I feel is that you're defining meaning by life. We're living, and therefore there's life. But then if you look at the anthropologists, for example, Tim Ingold, he questions into the very definition of life already, that it's the scientific construction and scientific being part of, some of the society, but other societies, other indigenous knowledge, the life is defined a completely way. So for example, the sun, as Tim Ingold says, well, in some of the cultures, he says it's a life that moves across our sky. In that way, the definition of when life begins, it starts to make meaning. The definition of meaning starts to change, right? How do we deal with this? And my second question is more related to this discipline of translation studies. I feel what you are doing, what Piotr, Africa, what you're doing is setting up the discourse about, letting people to know this is translation, or what translation should be on different levels. What I am concerning is responding to your ecological crisis at the beginning. I don't really feel like, apart from raising awareness, that we're providing a solid, methodology to deal with the crisis. How would you, or where do you think the translation studies as a discipline should go towards a translational methodology in front of this material and ecological crisis? Thank you very much.
Those are really good and really hard questions, both of them. So we can never know everything about everything. So when you try to explain something, you always explain it in terms of some decisions that you have made, right? And what you are asking here is, where does the decision come from to define life in this way? So I think we need to understand the difference between biology and their definition and philosopher sociologists like Ingold and their definition. And their definitions differ for a number of reasons. One of the reasons is that the data that they are looking at is different, right? Ingold wants to argue for the value of the material, right? And the role that it plays in human society. Biologists want to explain where life came from and how life works. So it's kind of two different questions that are being asked. So that's the first thing. Do we need to synthesize these positions? I think not. We need to translate them. And that's what I'm trying to do now by explaining to you. I'm translating Ingold and I'm translating biosemiotics, and I hope that by translating both, you might understand the different angles. So at this, I have written quite a bit about these arguments about in materialism, about vitality, vitalisms. I must say, personally, I'm not too convinced of them. I have read some of Ingold's work, and I've read Barat's work, who also makes these kind of vitalist claims. So the problem for me is, if inert matter is alive, what is life? Right? So I think there's indeed a problem that the distinction between life and non-life, or life and inert matter, isn't that absolute, just as the distinction between humans and other animals isn't that absolute. But the fact that it's not an absolute distinction doesn't mean that there's no distinction. Right? So I think sometimes in the humanities, we have this tendency to build our arguments saying, well, it's not absolute. And then the next step is, therefore it doesn't exist. And that can't be, or therefore it exists completely. So what I would like to have is some kind of, I think, for me, as a, let's say from a phenomenological perspective, there's a difference between inert matter and live matter. Not an absolute difference, but a difference that you can describe. And for me, then inert matter responds purely to physical laws, not to semiotic interactions, while live matter somehow evolved the ability to also include abstract, non-material ideas into their fold in some way. The question, your question about methodology, I think that's one of the reasons why I like speaking to students, because they will figure this out. They will probably have a better grasp on these things than I have. You know, sometimes you start thinking about something, but there are so many implications that you just don't get to. And that's why you speak to other people so they can also take it up. But in terms of a methodology, what I have sort of worked out is exactly what I told you now, is that one of the problems that we are grappling with. So firstly, it's these different epistemologies, right? So do you take spiritualism? Do you take realism? Do you take materialism? And these things are, at this point, what we say is, well, I don't like that one, but I'm too scared to say it's wrong. So let each one just stay in their own corner. So that's a kind of a solipsism that you get. The other option is to say, well, I know which one is right and bugger the rest. And that's a kind of a universalism that you get. I think I would like to operate between them with a translational or I'm calling it sort of a translational ecology of epistemologies, right? Where we keep them talking to one another and trying to explain them to one another without the one wanting to change the other one, right? The influence will emerge, and if something comes out of it, it comes out of it, but if not, but that we are pretty impotent against the threat of an ecological crisis. I agree with you, and I don't know how to solve that.
We have quite a lot of questions in the chat. Maybe I'll just continue. There's one very practical one. Are we able to assess quality of biosemiotic translation? And how would we be able to do that?
If you get it wrong, you die. It's as simple as that, right? In a sense, my one question is, why would you want to assess it? Let the dog decide, right? You're not going to tell the dog how well to interpret the smell. You can teach them things to help them survive, but I think on the one hand, we want to respect each species and the way in which they interact with their environment. Because remember, the theory of evolution suggests that whatever you are, you have found a way to adapt to your environment. You are fitted into your environment. So it's not for somebody from the outside to judge whether that works well or not. If it doesn't work for you, your species will die out or you will die out. Yeah. So to be honest, I've never thought about quality in biosemiotic translation. And because it's non-professional translation that we are looking at, I don't think we should worry about it at all. Except, I mean, but it's even biosemiotically, if you want to cross the street and you guess the distance of the bus coming on and you get it wrong, I mean, then you're a splash against the front window, you know. So getting semiosis, getting translations wrong is sometimes a life and death thing. Yeah. I'm not sure that's a good answer, but I don't have a better one for now.
Yeah, and in a lot of situations it is. I mean, even in regular, you know, kind of the mainstream translation work in medical situations,
yeah,
crisis situations. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'll skip so that I can, you know, come to the later questions as well. So there's a question that says, could you please go back to approach, avoid, ignore triad? Doesn't it remind you of hermeneutics movement? Biosemiotics seems to give us the most economically efficient way to summarize any translation technique. So your presentation also brought to mind the fact that in human biology, translation is used in entirely different way. Should we endeavor to find terminological coherence between biology and biosemiotics? Any thoughts you may want to share on this matter? Thank you, Andy says.
Okay, this is heavy one. So let me just say, could you go back to the triad? Does it remind you of the hermeneutic movement? Biosemiotics seems to give information. So I would not want to reduce all translation processes to this kind of basic one. I think that would be against everything that I think and that I stand for. What I just wanted to say is we need to study the translation process at the level at which it occurs, right? So what we've typically done, we've said, even between humans, right? English people went to South Africa and they say, oh goodness, the people here aren't human because they can't even speak English, right? So we've applied a certain value, and then we said, okay, this means they are worth less than we are. Similarly, we have done with animals. We value animal life less than human life normally, because we have this sort of judgment that that they operate at a different level or a lower level, right? So what I think people like Tim Ingold and others are trying to do is to say, it doesn't matter at what level you operate. Each level is valuable in itself. And if we can get that kind of argument going, I think we might move forward a bit. So it is in the sense hermeneutics. Well, not in a sense. I think hermeneutics is just a part of the whole translation semiosis activity or circle, if you want to call it that. I would just warn against reducing, because in human and even higher animals, the translation processes are much more complex and there's much more at stake, and there are many more factors that play a role than the very basic ones. Then I just want to see, brought to mind the fact that human biology. I don't know to answer the second part of the question, Andy. For now, I wouldn't bother too much about terminology. terminological coherence. I think what we want to is try to grow our understanding of these things. To me, it's a it's a very European thing to try and sort out the terminology before you do anything. And I think I'm sort of coming from the other way around. Let's try and explore concepts and thinking about it, and then terminology can or cannot follow. Sorry, I don't have a good answer for you on that one.
Thank you. I think with that answer, you kind of answered also, and with all the talks before, the question about clarity on how does framework affects our perception of translation agents in the interaction between humans and animals. But if you want to add anything.
Yeah, so the point is just that if you take this position, you will grant each species or each animal translationary agency or semiotic agency, right? At their level, you will grant them that, and you will try to understand it for what it is, and be able to not make it the same as yours, but keep it. This again comes to the question that the guy who asked me the question about Tim Ingold. So a translational, let's say a translational ethics between humans and other species means that we don't shout over them, we don't allow them to shout over us, but we translate and try to understand and try to value the others for what they are, not only for what they mean to us, but for what they are in themselves. There's a very interesting book. I can try and send Dr. Todorova the details. It's called the Phenomenology of Things. What does it mean to be a thing? Right? And this is about how can we understand what it means to be a tree? And can we? And how do we go about it? I mean, that would be a lecture all in itself. So, yeah.
Thanks. Yeah. Let's see. I think I've missed a few.
There was one about endosemiotics in plants that I wanted to answer. Where was it? Oh, that's anemone. Okay. So, yeah, that's very interesting. So, for instance, when the temperature drops below 10 degrees, plants, through their leaves, sense this drop in temperature. And I can't tell you in which way they sense it, whether it's a chemical thing or not. But then that activates chemicals in the plant, in the leaf, to start turning the colors of the leaf and to start sealing off the leaf from the stem so that it can fall off, so that it can overwinter, right? Also, when that process starts, the whole process of feeding in the plant and sending down food and bringing up, what would they send down? Carbohydrates, I think, they bring up water and minerals. Those processes change because of the sensing in the leaves that the temperature has dropped. It's not only temperature, it's also the time of daylight. If so many, I think it's 10 hours of daylight. It's probably also different plants would respond differently to it. But so you get inside the plant, you get those. And at plant level, remember, it's not the communication of a brain. It is the communication of chemicals that get interpreted and that then activate other chemicals to do certain things. But the interesting thing is that this isn't an absolutely mechanical process, because not all trees lose their leaves at the same time. They respond differently too. And if you have a tree next to in a city next to a light, it gets more light. Then it keeps the leaves for longer. So it's messages inside the tree.
Thank you. It's amazing. Another question says, are there studies of the reading process from the viewpoint of biosemiotics?
Reading. Not, you mean like reading a book, I assume. Not that I'm aware of now, but what you would find is in cognitive translation studies, you would find, let's say, a study about how the functions of the eye, the muscles in the eye, the contractions in the eye, the brain functions, and all these kinds of things work together in a reading process. So you would have these eye tracking devices and screen tracking types, tracking your, what is this where you type on? That thing. So yes, I haven't seen a biosemiotic study. Biosemioticians typically study non-humans and leave, but there are some that study humans, but mostly non-humans. So human studies on reading and perception and all these kinds of things, you would find them in education, you would find them in as I said, the embodied cognition studies that neurological studies these days that gets done.
I think we have one or two more questions left before we close the session for today. Maybe we have time to answer all of them. So one is, could you clarify the way biosemiotics challenges constructivism and idealism? Of course, I see the anthropocentric nature of the two approaches, but I can't connect with biosemiotics.
Yeah. So seeing the anthropocentric nature is the one. In other words, it's not only humans that construct. Well, at least mammals also construct environments. I mean, that movie about the octopus shows how she built a nest and how she even hid herself underneath shells and so on. But what I'm actually suggesting here is that there's a nice book that you can read by Professor Timo Marais. It was published in 2020, and I think it's just called Ecosemiotics. I will see if I can maybe send you a few readings that you can distribute in the class. And Marais makes the argument that, especially in the Western world, people think that we live in language only. We live in Persian terms, we live in symbols only. We don't live in icons and indexes, if you understand Persian semiotics. And he argues against that. So what I'm trying to argue here is to link to Marais is to say, I think, well, we all know that we construct knowledge, right? I don't think that's a debate. But what in translation studies, very few, if any, people think about is, how does the things about which I construct my knowledge contribute to the construction of my knowledge? Because if you cannot explain the role of the other in your knowledge construction or meaning making, then you are just being a god or an asshole or a tyrant that imposes yourself on the other, right? So if I study a rock, how does the rock influence my understanding? Obviously, I construct knowledge. It has to be. But so biosemiotics help us to explain that we are not only constructing, we are also constructed. We have evolved in certain ways, which means we fit into our world in a certain way, which means for instance, there are certain sounds that humans can't hear and colors that we can't see. So our being in a certain body is already a construction. We have been made like this. So I'm just sort of irritating people who sort of overreach what humans can do. I'm sort of reminding them that we are also being constructed. And I mean, if it's 45 degrees and you have no outside and you have no air conditioner, you can construct that heat as much as you want. It's going to construct you in the end. So that's why I'm saying it. Biosemiotics talks about the materiality, about the embodiedness of being an organism, and that it's an interplay between constructing and being constructed. And I think constructivism and idealism thinks it's only us that make meaning, and the only meaning is in our heads. And I think it's more complicated than that.
Thank you. I think there's just one more question left, as far as I can see, and it's quite long, from someone who is reviewing your edited volume, Translation Beyond Translation Studies. I'll for the sake of time, I'll just read the question. So today we have clearly revealed that organisms have the semiotic ability. However, you have claimed that semiotics should form the emergent link between physical, chemical, biological, psychological, and the social. So this is a quote from a book 2014. Since the semiotics is the border between the psychological and the social stratum, the translation process within semiosis takes place between the psychological and the social stratum. But we know non-human organisms belong to the biological stratum, not the psychological. So my question is, does these two things contradict? And if not, how do you deal with the seeming paradox?
Let me see who wrote this.
It's from, right, I can't.
Sorry, I can't read that. Winston Lee.
Yeah.
Okay.
Winston Lee, yeah.
Yeah, you are 100% correct. The stuff that I wrote about the semiotic border in 2014 is nonsense. You can just ignore it. It is indeed a paradox, and I have changed my ideas about it. So I think what you are showing, and I sort of to confirm that as we grow and as we think, we change our minds. And there's nothing wrong for you as a student and as a critical reader to point these things out and to say, but you've now, you've gone against what you said before. I fully take responsibility. My insight, it's just that at a certain point you have a certain insight and then it grows. And so I no longer see this semiotic border between the psychological and the social. That's for me nonsense, sorry to say. So for me, there are two large break lines, if I can call it. So the one break line for me is between non-life and life. So non-life is for me a category of existence. Life is for me a category of existence, which means humans, plants, non-human animals, everything in one. And then there is probably a second line at language. So where humans have language ability, which gives them reflective ability. So John Deely, for instance, said all animals use signs, but only human animals know that they are using signs and can reflect on it. So language gave us, and I wrote about that in the Trajectories book, if you want to go and read it. Language gives us that ability to reflect on our own thought, which an animal cannot do. Animal, according to what we know now, animals cannot think about their thinking, while non-human animals, while human animals, according to what we know, can. So yes, you are 100% right. That's nonsense. You can criticize it, or you better just ignore it.
Thank you so much, Professor Marais. I think we've reached the end, so maybe we can close this talk for today. Thank you again from me, the Center for Translation Studies at Hong Kong Baptist University, and from everyone in the audience who's saying thank you in the chat. Thank you for such a lovely talk. and you know, for inspiring us to think beyond what we see every day. Thank you so much, and hope to see you soon again.
Pleasure. Thanks for having me. Thanks,
Thank you.
Mariette.
Bye. Bye, everyone.
Bye, everybody.